We are here to bring you everything and anything surrounding Porsche. I'm Mike.
I'm Aaron.
And this is Peak Car Talk.
Episode 245. On this one, we have Pete Stout from 000. This is going to be part one of part two because it went over 2 hours. It was great. All right, here we go.
Hey, welcome to an episode of Peak Car Talk. I'm Mike.
And I'm Aaron.
And we have special guest Pete Stout from 000 Magazine, editor-in-chief and managing partner. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. So, big stuff coming, and 000 is always doing a lot of great stuff. Big thing right now is the 000 Commission, right? And partnering with the 43 Institute, Ken Block's Institute. Tell us a little bit about that build as we get going here and how it even came, that partnership with 43 Institute and how all this kind of came together.
Well, in a way, it all starts with Larry Chen and has continued with Larry Chen, who's been a partner to the magazine since issue 2, phenomenal photographer, all-around car nut, and just good soul. And we invited him on a photo shoot back in 2017 when we started the magazine for issue number 2. And then we also partnered with him to photograph a Pikes Peak race car. Although at the time it wasn't yet a Pikes Peak race car, it was just an art exercise on Pikes Peak at the height and the beginning of COVID. So that was 2020, June That's or right, 2020 or so.
Because they delayed the race or canceled, I should say, right? So, but the mountain was still scheduled. Larry's actually been on the show, so we're very close with Larry too. And you guys got the mountain to yourselves to kind of shoot, right? Which was unique.
It's pretty epic.
Yeah, I mean, Larry's constantly putting everybody together, isn't he? And so in this case, it really does seem like all roads lead to Larry Chen. But in this case, we all were led to a road up at Pikes Peak. And the reason was we were doing this crazy art wrap on a GT2 RS Club Sport. And the idea was to try to create a viral cover or a really interesting cover image at the least. We had to keep going with content in COVID times. And this was right when no one knew anything about it. We didn't know how it was transmitted. Was it air? Was it touch? Whatever. Couldn't fly. But we had to keep going. And the car was in Colorado. So quickly was, what's the best location in Colorado? And of course, it's Pikes Peak. So I called Larry and said, hey, and he was kind of twiddling his thumbs too and said, I'm all in. So we took a crazy road trip. And so fast forward 4 years, and it was time to do something with a sweepstakes car. We wanted to give away a 992 Turbo S 000 commission, which is a 992 Turbo S edited by 000 with Sonderwunsch in Germany and PCNA. And so we can talk about that in a minute, but I called Larry and said, hey, we're looking for the right charity partner for this giveaway. And he said, well, have you thought about 43i? And I said, what's 43i? And he said, well, it's Ken Block's foundation. It's a foundation established right after we lost Ken Block to kind of carry on his mission. So I looked that up. And I knew of Ken Block. I didn't get to know Ken Block, but I certainly knew of him. And he was on the hill with us in 22 when we went back to race with another 992 Turbo S. And it was kind of a heartbreaker. My daughter and I were up there. At first day, we drew the short straw. We were on the top section. And if you've been up there, you know that that's not really a paddock. It's like the surface of the moon.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's bad.
It's like for your first intro, 9 years old. And then 40-something dad, and we're up there, having driven into Colorado the night before from the Bay Area, and so a 2 a.m. wake up, 9-year-old's first time on a racing team, surface of the moon, cars dodging a giant boulder on the way out to the starting line for the practice session, 9,000 feet, actually much higher than 9,000 feet, probably something closer to 11, 12,000 feet, and I got altitude sickness, even though I'd driven up there with no problem for photo shoots. I got altitude sickness, luckily fought it down and kept it together. She was fine. 9-year-old, everybody else is puffing oxygen. She's just fine. But I remember standing there to go watch David Donner take off in the 992 Turbo S on launch control. and the Huna Pegasus came up the hill, and it sounded sick. Like you could tell that Ken's car wasn't running right. And I believe it was later that night that I believe it was later that night they pulled the plug on the program due to engine parts not available. And so as soon as, Larry mentioned it, I remembered that. I remember that car not running right. And I would later learn Ken had always wanted to race a Porsche. And so he was finally running a Porsche with support by Porsche Motorsport North America, obviously BBI, and so many more. And so I liked that. I liked that that was a team that was there when we were involved with the 992 Turbo S. They were racing also. And I liked the idea of one team that went on to win. Donner won, placed second overall in a street car, beating every race car but one. And then we went back again. But I like the idea of circling back for another team because nobody on our team was happy when that car was out. You always want to see your competitors take that green flag. Mm-hmm. But once I looked up Larry Chen's recommendation and saw that 43i is for motivated misfits, and I identify this way. I didn't always have the easiest time in school. I was interested in technical things and theater and other stuff, visual arts. And so 43i is for finding pathways for people who aren't born into the motorsports community, who aren't born into action sports, and who aren't born into the creative arts. And if you go to their website, as I did, I say, hey, okay, 000 so far isn't so into action sports, but we're all about motorsports and we're all about supporting people in the visual arts. What are we if not celebrating those things? Mm-hmm. So I loved it as the charitable partner. And that's how 000 circled back to support Ken Block's vision.
That makes total sense. I mean, thank you for sharing that. Like that, wow, like literally full circle, right? Larry Chen is the glue for all of that. Like it seems like that in the automotive industry, at least of lately, right? Like I feel like Jeff Swart is still that guy too in a lot of aspects, at least in the Porsche realm, and slowly passing that torch to Larry because obviously, like Larry says many times, Jeff's my mentor and and another great photographer, great eye, another, obviously I know you're very familiar with Jeff. But yeah, great story. What a great cause. How do people get involved if they want to either, donate to that charity, if they want to try to win the 000, how do they do that?
So if they want to donate directly, I really recommend just looking up 43institute.org or just look up 43i or 43 Institute and you can go straight to the website, check it out. If you want to win the 992 Turbo S 000 commission car, you can check that out on our Insta or other platforms, or you can just go directly to our website, and any purchase you make during the sweepstakes period has a benefit to 43i and, of course, enters you for a chance to win the 911 Turbo S.
Outstanding. And when's the deadline on that for people to get that in?
I would defer to our team, but I believe it's end of March. I should have that down. I'm usually, as with many creatives, I'm somewhat calendar deaf, but it's end of March.
Okay. We don't need an exact date. I know because we're going to get DM'd. They're like, hey, when's my last chance to do that? As many people very, very busy, or they're going to be like, I'm going to default to the 000 staff.
And I can identify as a fellow creative procrastinator. So all good, all good.
Mm-hmm. So that road trip you guys took in the GT4s with Larry too, I remember that being documented, and what an interesting time that was for you guys to say, hey, let's go take a road trip. And is that the time where, I mean, I know Larry had shot, but is that the time where you guys got to really get to know Larry a little bit more and spend a little bit more time with him?
Definitely, and Louis Yao too. And we met them in kind of a bombed out spot in LA before hitting the road. And we're like, why are we here? And then I saw the background. I was like, yeah, okay, I see why we're here. And Louis Yao and Larry were there. And I'll never forget leaving. They were in the GT4. We were in a Spider. And they were in a racing yellow GT4. And we were in a gentian blue Spider. And Louis Yao had brought this giant box, I mean, the size of my house, of Cheez-Its. And so it was this big box of Cheez-Its in the back window of the GT4 leaving LA. I was like, all right, this is going to be okay. But I think it was. I mean, that was a credit to Porsche Cars North America. Called up Luke Van Zandy and Frank Wiesman and said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing this thing. I normally don't like to ask for a long distance loan, but would you consider this? I think that be an interesting road trip, and it's in support of this other thing. So we'll build a storyline out of two sports cars out against the world, because it's a pretty quiet world right now."
Absolutely.
And Frank and Luke were kind to support that road trip. And so, I imagine it was a foregone conclusion for Larry when I called. It's like, "Hey, would you like to road trip out to Pikes Peak, have the mountain to yourself to shoot? And by the way, you can drive a GT4 one way, a Spider the way back." And but I remember what a tonic those cars were in that road trip. The two cars split at one point on the way out, and Alex, the co-founder, Alexander Plevsky, 20 plus year friend, and I were out in the wilds of Utah in that Spider. And I thought, I didn't know how much I needed this, because I've been cooped up like everybody else. And we're like out in the middle of those painted canyons and just long vistas. And I was like, man, this is just great. And this car, I could keep going to Indiana. So there's full circle with that too, because from that gentian blue Spider in the middle of nowhere, went a text to a friend in Germany. I said, "Hey, the Spider's pretty great. Might be my favorite thing in the lineup right now. But could your team get rid of all this Alcantara? Because we didn't like the Alcantara." And he wrote, personal preference. So he writes back. He's like, "Yes." He's like, "And would you like to do a kind of 000 edition or a package or something?" And I was like, "What?" Looking at my phone on my lap, I'm like, "What?"
You're like, "Is this real?"
Exactly. I mean, that was editing cars, which we didn't know we would later call the process that, was certainly not on the radar when we started this project in 2016. And that ended up resulting in a 000 package for the 718 Spider that was kind of the early calls talked about it as an animal style offering. So you had to know to ask.
Yeah.
And
I like that.
39. The Germans asked at one point, "How many do you hope to sell?" on one of the calls. And every call I kept waiting for them to say, "Hey, this isn't going to work." But they were bored during COVID too. And so there were these calls back and forth. They were really fun. And I never took it too seriously. And I said, "Well, how many do you hope to sell?" And we said 5. And then after, Alex went, maybe 2 people will like this, what we like. And in the end, they sold 39 cars worldwide. Wow. And that also came out of that road trip with Lewis and Larry and Alex.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so really underestimated the demand for that, huh? In a good way, right? So that's great. I remember when that came out, and we've been fortunate enough to see a couple of them out here on the East Coast. I think Merit Partners ended up with one, and even our local dealership here in Porsche Clearwater had one. And man, what a beautiful car, right? So that was basically the catalyst for that whole build series, right?
Yeah, it was that gentian blue Spider on all black Alcantara, black roof, and that's the car that Larry shot the art car from that day on Pikes Peak. Lewis driving, and they surprised us. I mean, typical Larry Chen, over deliver. They surprised us with 2 40-minute road trip videos that we didn't know were coming. And part 1 is Lewis and Larry stopping off to go off-roading in Miatas and do all sorts of other stuff. Part 2, people ask, "Oh, how does a photo shoot work? What does that look like?" And if you're in the business, it's like watching paint dry. But, after a certain amount of years. But it isn't. There are really exciting parts of it and really fun. And that was one of the wildest photo shoots I've ever been on in terms of location and risk and all sorts of other stuff. And I would say that what blew me away about part 2 is Larry Chen and Lewis deliver a master class on how a photo shoot goes. And what's so incredible is the amount of time they spent editing. So you see how they're going to take the photo. You see them taking the photo, and then the video stops and you see the final image. And then they continue on to the next place and taking the photo and then the photo. I've never seen any video like that at that level.
It was very unique. I enjoyed watching it too. I mean, they do such a good job, that his team and his staff. I mean, it's unbelievable the content that they produce. And and also like genuinely loves the work, right? And a nice guy, right? Like a workaholic guy, really.
Yeah, the other part of that video that was meaningful personally was just hearing his heart for the work, why he does what he does, and why he was excited to be shooting that day. And he had never had the mountain to himself. He'd always been there. He's the official photographer, and he's one of the top five or so. He's way up there at the top of all the photographers that I've worked with up there, for the race typically.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, he and Lindbergh and some others really brought phenomenal new eyes to that place. I had been assigning stories to Pikes Peak racing for probably more than a decade before that. And there were also some very, very talented photographers that I was fortunate to work with. But Larry and Lindbergh really brought these new eyes. When I first saw their images, I was like, whoa, where's this coming from and what's going on here? So to get to work with them with the mountain closed, I thought it was my privilege entirely, but Larry was also thrilled. And you hear that in that video.
Yeah, absolutely. He's definitely expressing that all the way through. Let's circle back on your career. I think it's pretty interesting, like the start, right? Obviously started way before some of the data we have, but how did you get into Porsche? And then let's talk about how that segued into Excellence Magazine.
Well, I guess I got into Porsche by way of the A1 Rabbit diesel that blew up in my family. I had designs as a kid to hot rod that Rabbit diesel because as a kid might think, it's like, oh, it's smog exempt. California kids have to think about these things. So the diesel was quite interesting. I, of course, had to figure out the whole picture of what that might mean. But the car blew up before I was able to get any mitts on it. And that left the only other car not in use by my parents, which was my brother's 914, which I thought was deeply uncool. I was way more into the Rabbit diesel. Way more into the Rabbit diesel. And but when you're 16, wheels are wheels, and it's freedom. So the deal was, if I could resurrect the 914 and fix it, it wasn't running. It just needed a clutch, I think, mainly, and then to be kind of gone through. But if I could resurrect the car, pay for gas and pay for insurance, I could drive it, was kind of the deal. And so I didn't know at the time that it would teach me as much as it did, between responsibility but also momentum. When you're 16 and it's got 80 horsepower, you quickly learn not to slow down because you'll never get back up to speed. So that was kind of my introduction to Porsche, was that car, which of course was a car that was ridiculed. It was actually a voted hooptiest car my senior year of high school in the yearbook.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And it's that car is still with me. I've kept it all these years, but
that's outstanding.
But and 914 kind of came into its own. Back then it was ridiculed as so many things, and so many things it wasn't. But what I think I would, knowingly or not knowingly, it taught me what good steering feels like. It taught me what good technique is in terms of engineering. Like, there's really, besides the EFI on a 914-4, there's really nothing on it that's much more complicated than a Beetle.
Yeah.
Or the VW bus my dad drove for 30 years. So I could work on it. In other words, I could work on it. And in a way, the Porsche community made space for me very directly. The club, I joined when I was a teenager, but didn't really fit in that well. I identified more with like autocrossing with the Fiat guys and like the BMW guys and whatever. But there was a couple of businesses, one in particular called Easy, which you may have been to or know about here. And it was a Porsche dismantler in the East Bay in Emeryville, California. And I couldn't afford to run a Porsche with parts from the dealer back then. And so Jim Brazil, who started Easy and owned it, kind of took me under his wing, as did some others, Spencer, and there were some others there who kind of would take me under their wing and help me out. And that made it possible to keep that 914 running and even start to improve it.
Nice.
So that started the road to Porsche. And then
It's
as
like you
far
and
as
Jeff
writing,
Swart have like a same 914 origin story, kind of. He's his baby he still owns, like that 914.6.
right, I've been in and driven that car. I mean, Jeff is definitely also somebody I consider a friend and a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
He I didn't know when I first met him that his yellow 914 was his first car. So we both still have our first car, and both of those 914s. I mean, you look at what he's done with his and Panama, Alaska Rally, and
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of different things. The Millen birthday hill climb. There's all kinds of things he's done that really, really cool with that car. I haven't used mine for competition purposes, but I think I'm at 265,000 miles is the best estimate now.
That's awesome.
And
It's a good job.
that little car, I think issue 14, I brought it along as a fallback because there was this opportunity to photograph a 917K and drive it here at Sonoma Raceway, my home track.
Wow.
But the night before I was supposed to drive the 917K, it was raining. And so I slept like a baby. I don't always sleep the best before a track, like a serious track day. I start thinking too much. And I slept like a baby because I made the decision I'm not driving tomorrow because it's going to be raining. But I had to find some value, right? I had to find some value in this opportunity. So I was thinking, well, what can we do if we can't drive the 917? These have been photographed endlessly. And I thought, well, it's the 50th anniversary of the design of the 917 and of the 914. They were both 1969 designs, better known for 1970 for varying reasons. But I remembered two press images that blew me away, which were of a 914 and a 917. One, I think, I don't quote me on this, but I think one is at Spa and the other one's at the Ring, or I don't remember now. But there's these two photos and they do the same thing. The 914 looks like a bus next to the 917. And you always think a little bit like Countach. Like when I think about the Lamborghini Countach, the first time I saw one, I couldn't believe how small it was, especially an early one.
Yeah.
Because in your mind, it lives large, and a 917 lives large in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see it next to a 914, it's tiny. And a 914 is tiny. Like I get out of mine and people can't believe I fit in it. And so I thought, well, I got 24 hours to find a 914 that I could use. And I realized my car is actually a decent stand-in. Like the front spoiler is a little bit off and it shouldn't have a hood crest. It's a youthful indiscretion, but otherwise pretty close to one of those cars. So we went to go recreate that side-by-side image with Lisa Linka, photographer. And then I ended up driving the 917K anyway in the rain at Sonoma, which is a track with consequences. And I was out 3 times in the car. And I, back to back with my own 914, I was driving my high school 914 hooptiest car next to Richard Atwood in a 917K on my home track. Wow. And then we pulled over, and then I got in the 917 to follow David Donahue around the track in the wet. And so it's like I think about Jeff Swart's 914.6 and my 914.4, which became a 6 later. I put a 6 in later. But I think about those two cars and like, where do they take us? And I think that's true of any of these. That's one of the coolest things about Porsche for me is people think they're expensive, but they're actually accessible. There's a way. Usually if there's a will, there's a way. Today's 914 to me is an early Boxster, and it's a vastly better car on so many levels. Heater, air conditioner, rust. You can go down the list. M96, okay, you can make some points, but I'd rather fix an engine than rust. And so I look at that and I think, well, where can that car take you? My road doesn't have to be unique. Like it's just, there's opportunity there in every one of these cars they've made. It can take you into circles that you would have never expected. I'm sure the two of you have similar stories down that road.
Absolutely. Sure. I couldn't agree more. And that's actually a really great point because, as you've been in the Porsche world for decades and, we've been going on it on our second decade, and it's there's a lot of stigma right behind an early Boxster, and we've been telling people for years and years and years and years, if you really want, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Like it's you and the car, and if you're gonna have fun, that's what all of this stuff is supposed to be about to begin with. And we preach that so much, and some people hear it, some people don't. But like everybody's like, well, I got to buy an air-cooled 911 right away. It's like, you don't have to do that to have a good time and experience things and enjoy these pieces of machinery that are so well engineered. You brought up a great point, like a 986 Boxer. It's such a great piece of engineering for so cheap.
Well, it's an interesting thing on two fronts. When it came time to buy a wedding ring, I had to sell one of my Porsches, and by then had achieved what every 914 owner wants, and probably a lot of A1 Rabbit owners too, is they want to get, as Brian Scott likes to say, they want to get the Super Beetle, they want to get a 911, and they go. So I went and I found this really great 911 SC through a friend, and bought it, and I was like, oh. I'd like to get to know my wife on weekends, not 2 sets of brake master cylinders, not 2 brake master cylinders, just one. And so I had to sell one, and I sold the 911. And part of the thinking was I can always find another good one. It's hard to find a good 914 back then even. And I wasn't, that was 20 some odd years ago, so I wasn't as attached to the car emotionally as I am now necessarily. But the 914 was also more fun in some ways than that 911. That 911, I knew I was going to have to sort out the suspension. The engine was strong, and it was the best shifting 915 I've ever tried. And the car was right. Like, the car had the look, it was great, but I knew I was going to have to sort the suspension, and that wasn't going to be a simple job to get to where I wanted it to be. And I loved the 914 the way it was, even as a 4. But I think another one of those comparisons for me was when I was first getting into the business of evaluating cars. Excellence Magazine sent me as a college student down to the 986 US press launch, which was held in Phoenix, Scottsdale area. And I drove my second press car ever. The first press car I ever drove was a 993 Turbo with a very scared Bob Carlson next to me in the passenger seat. I was probably like every 20-year-old hack who thought he could drive. And here's, poor Bob in there with this factory press car with 400 horsepower. And today, 400, no big deal. But back then it was a spaceship.
Yep.
And imagine all the more for a kid with an 80 horsepower 914 on roads he doesn't know.
Yeah.
So the only press car experience I had when I drove that Boxster was the 993 Turbo. And I ended up driving that car around, I guess what was called Firebird Raceway, later Bondurant, with Hurley Haywood as a teacher, which was also its own experience. Yeah, that would be the beginning of 10 years of intensive training from factory drivers, which was another legacy of Bob Carlson. But what blew my mind was as I was driving around this Boxster, I thought, 21-year-old, 22-year-old Pete was thinking, if you gave me the keys, and this is going to be sacrilegious, so if you need to beep out the rest of this, it's okay. But 22-year-old Pete, and you can start the beeping anytime now, I said, if you were going to give me the key and I had to keep it, 993 Turbo or this, I would have taken the Boxster. And that is a wild comment, right? I still think those cars are that good. If you take money out of the equation, 993 Turbo, of course, collector item, and gorgeous and fast and special. And I love the thin A-pillars and groundbreaking car, amazing. One of Tony Hatter's best designs, among many good designs. Fantastic, fantastic car. But if it's just for fun and you don't care what somebody else is assigning to it in terms of value, even the earliest 986s are a blast. They're just pure fun.
Yeah. And there's something about that top-down experience, right? And I think, as all of us have been in Porsche, and another thing that we say a lot on the podcast, there's something about that, right? Probably when you had that Spider, when you get to hear that engine and all of that muffling is away, the top is down, and you think back to the old Spider days, right? Like the 550 Spiders and, James Dean and those guys. I know it's not the same thing, but if you have a good imagination, it's kind of a time warp in a sense where you're kind of like, hey, this is the modern iteration of what that is. And if you get in there and you have that kind of mindset, it can time travel you somewhere.
Absolutely. And a lot of people don't fully recognize how special that car is. Forged magnesium top frame, aluminum alloy, 4-piston calipers at all 4 corners, flat 6, 4 valves per cylinder. And I still maintain the 2.5 was really special because it had a howl through third gear through that side intake on the driver's side.
Mm-hmm.
That, it's not CGT, but it's CGT-ish. It's like it's a short span. It's just 1,000 or 1,500 RPM, if I remember correctly. But on full throttle, second and third and other gears, but mainly second and third is where the fun is had in that car for me. A little bit of fourth maybe, but second and third are, nice and short for that little 2.5 engine. And the way it howls through the range, in the mid-range, is intoxicating. I still think those cars just lowered, and that's about it. Maybe some wheels, tires. They look fantastic, at least to these eyes.
Yeah, I agree with you. And they're aging, I think, very gracefully, right?
Kind of like first Cayenne. I didn't care for the first Cayenne all that much when it came out. I was like, why doesn't that look like the Infiniti? And now I see the Infiniti, I'm like, ooh. And I see the early Cayennes, especially with maybe some tires, maybe a little suspension, or my favorite set of big tires with the standard air suspension dumped down with big mud flaps. They look great. Like those look great to me. So kind of like Boxsters, sometimes, and with other Porsches too, sometimes the subtle route comes out good in the end.
Yeah, I agree.
Pretty much nailed our collections. He's got an early Cayenne, and I have a Boxster, so with pretty much zero exhaust. Then it took off the baffling for the intake, so there I can attest to the howl and the loud noise.
What year is your Boxster?
90. It's a 99.
What's that?
No, it's
99. That's what How many miles?
Guards red. 39,000, I think.
Oh, it's a low mile car.
Low miles.
PTS now. Guards red is PTS.
Yeah. As I like to say, Guards red is the new PTS. Although now they make you pay for it. It was for a long time. It was the $0 PTS.
Exactly.
Co-founder at 000 would call. He's like, I'm looking at a Guards red 993 or 992 GT3. I'm like, whoa! It's got to be one of like 3 because there's dozens and dozens, hundreds of PTS GT3s, but Guards red is really rare.
Yep.
It's a great color. It's in my opinion, on some cars, it's fantastic.
That's what my 964 is Guards red. So
nice. Yeah, it's underrated on some cars, like 996 GT2. Guards red looks incredible to me with the big silver wheels. 993s for some reason, for me, they really work in non-metallics. I like them in metallics too, but the non-metallic, as time has gone by, I've started to really, really dig 993s and non-metallics.
Yeah.
And I ordered a Guards red GT4. My first new Porsche was Guards red.
Yay.
So, I'm walking the talk, something like that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But, Aaron, for your Boxster, my wife and I shared an Arena Red 99. My brother now has it. We bought it with 60,000 miles. He bought it from us with 100,000 miles. It had a rear main seal at 29,000 miles per the records. That car is still on the original engine at 236,000 miles last I checked. And the only expensive repair it's had since we brought it in a family at 60,000 miles was a heater core for around $3,000. That's it. Like,
oh wow, that is reliability. That's good peace of mind on my side for sure.
We know that not everybody's story is that way.
Yeah, that's true.
It's also nice to see that it's an interesting offset. When I sold it to my brother, I said, the only way I'm selling this car to you is if you get comfortable with the risk we took. Like, here's what's known. Here are the known problem areas. Mm-hmm. And if you can't get comfortable with the risk, I'm not selling it to you. And obviously he's had 136,000 miles on top of the 100,000 that he bought it with. It's been good miles.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun. A lot of fun there. So I know we talked about the 000 commission and all that, and kind of started your career. So what started 000 in general? I know you journalism and things like that. So you just decided, let's do a magazine in a time of the digital world.
Yeah, I mean, I made the leap to writing about Porsches in college. A guy came and spoke at the School About Dreams, a guy, Wintley Phipps, and every student was transfixed by him as a speaker, and that included me. And just kind of, with maybe not that day, but with time, I sort of realized maybe if you wrote about cars, you could drive everything you ever wanted to without having to own them, you know. And I had some questions about how I felt about pursuing my passion given social issues. And so I was kind of struggling through that as a college student and what that all meant, as college students often do, as adults, young adults often do. Where am I going? And also, what's realistic? Am I going to really be able to buy an F40? Like, is that really going to happen? Like, so you could write about it. You could be around these cars. And so I started freelancing for Excellence and Sports Car International. And that led to an internship, which led to a job. And I was at Excellence for 15 years. And it was really a huge blessing to be there. Got to know people like Bob Carlson, Hurley Haywood, David Murray, Case Nierop. The list goes on and on and on. Not to mention all sorts of German engineers, executives, designers. So it was really a tremendous opportunity, along with a ton of track time, which was no bad thing for someone who wanted to learn. Especially with teachers of the caliber and cars, not to mention the cars of that caliber. So in 2012, after about 15 years, I was hired by Porsche Club of America to rebuild and kind of redesign Panorama. So that was my next 3 years. And where 000 really came out of was, the good news of Panorama was, we pursued the art and saw the business come with it. I think it was 62% increase in ad revenue in 3 years in print. Wow. in the digital era. And that was really gratifying to see. You know, the executive council of PCA took a chance on it, and it really paid off. And the members seemed to be happy. But I had kind of built everything for 10 years. It just seemed like such a good fit. And then somebody came along and said, okay, saw what you did at Excellence, saw what you did at Pano. I'd like to see what you do with a blank slate, and I'll fund it. And so that's a pretty wild thing, right?
Yeah,
and luckily,
where do you start?
Yeah, well, luckily the English major over here had written about 7 business plans by then. The first, several of which were terrible.
Let's talk about the first 6. That's good.
Yeah, but maybe by 5 or 6 it was okay. And so I think this is probably the 7th. And I went back to him. And he said, "Hey, I haven't seen this honest of a business plan in probably 15 years. You know, come back to me. Let's take this further." I think first I brought him a concept, and it was a quarterly, and a lot of the goal of it was, by then the newsstand was dead. And one of my sounding boards was Alex Pilevsky, who would go on to become a co-founder, but back then he was just a friend and sounding board. And we both grew up reading car magazines. And as boys, our moms or dads would know to they'd bring it, and we knew that hours of fun were ahead. Mm-hmm. And so that became something where, when we started working together at Ross Periodicals, which had Excellence and Sports Car International and Vintage Motorsport and some others, we had this shared childhood. He grew up in LA, I grew up Bay Area, San Francisco area, East Bay to be particular. No one's ever heard of El Cerrito, but that's where I'm from. Unless they're Creedence Clearwater Revival fans. It's the only thing about El Cerrito. No. Yeah, CCR. And most of them don't think it's from the Bay Area. So, but we had this shared childhood. We could recite road tests and factoids from Car and Driver from when we were kids. And so Alex and I were kind of looking at all this, and we were watching the newsstand die, print advertising die, magazines die. And we felt like, okay, we don't know how to do much, but we know how to make magazines, and they mattered to us. So is there a business model that we can come up with where they have a future, where this cultural object around the automobile doesn't die? And at the end, I'm so stoked there's all these other platforms. I mean, here we are on a podcast. I can't do this from print, right? Henry Catchpole, Chris Harris, so many others. What they're doing on video, can't do it in media. They can't do it in print media. Awesome, right? But I still believe in the permanence of this cultural object. And so Alex and I started saying, okay, what could it look like to save this? What's the right frequency? What's the right size? Who's paying for it if the newsstand and advertising are both going downhill, which is what's killing magazines? So we took a shot at it. We said, we're gonna make something that reflects the quality of its subject. We're gonna make it for fewer people, and those people are gonna pay the freight. There's no other way. It's the only sustainable idea. And of course, it was terrifying when we launched.
I would imagine.
It seems like it would be. Yeah, for sure.
Literally, like launching a boat into an ocean with no navigation, essentially, right?
And here we go.
Oh, yeah. I mean, night before, I was like, oh, people tomorrow, they're going to think we're jerks. Like, who's asking $250 for a magazine subscription?
Yeah.
But, you know, we had
tested to pay for this.
Right. And, I mean, we tested it, you know, in sort of minor focus groups, but not friends. And initially, we got a lot of pushback. But then some said, you know, I pay more than that for one front tire for my 997. Like, what's my hourly rate at the dealer for shop labor? What's a dinner out? What's a night at the theater? And I thought, maybe it could work. And in the end, it did. You know, we're headed into our 9th year. Our editorial team doubled last year. So just really thankful
on that. Yeah, congratulations on that.
Thank you. I feel fortunate to work with the people I work with.
I just love that you guys have had that sustainability, and like, you know, I'm sure there's been ups and downs through the entire process, but I'm glad you've stayed the course, because you've shown, like, print. You were basically, like, I feel like one of the last standing pillars, and you launched in a time where, like you said, everything was dying. I was one of those kids too, because I grew up in the 80s. You know, I'm 45 years old, so I remember reading Car and Driver, and that was like my Bible to everything, right? Like, they didn't, you know, the one once in a while you see the TV show where they would, you know, do a car review, but, you know, it was 30 minutes on Sunday morning or something like that when you got to see it. Auto Week, or I think whatever it was. But other than that, it was the magazine. So I have a sentimental attachment to it as well, where the print, you know, like, and especially when traveling, when I was in my young 20s, you know, for work, and when I was in the corporate world, you know, picking up that magazine at the airport to read on the plane, you know, and that was a big deal. And, you know, now all that stuff has gone away kind of, and it's kind of, your guys like us and many like us out there all over the world are kind of like fishing for things, right?
Well, it's been a wild adventure. I mean, we didn't, you know, it's like we thought we knew where we were going. And like any small business, you launch and then you realize you need to make some adjustments to your path. And, you know, but there's other things. There's these hidden rewards along the way that you didn't expect, and you just have to go. You know, it may work, it may not. You know, I credit them, like, I credit the two people who believed in it the most with me from the beginning. You know, one was my wife, Rebecca. She was like, if this doesn't work out, we'll be okay, which is an amazing thing for a spouse to say to the other spouse. Like, go do this. And if it fails miserably, it's not going to affect us.
Yeah.
And, you know, our relationship.
That's an incredible gift to give your spouse too, because I mean, we think that's, you know, in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's how it worked out. And of course your spouse would do that, but let's be real. There's a lot of relationships behind closed doors. There's a lot of that. Are you out of your mind? You're not doing that. Like, we will lose the house. We will lose everything that we have going on, like, in this situation. Totally.
Pardon me. I have to go get a cord because I'm going to lose power here. So
no problem.
The other side of it is the co-founder, Alex Plebsky. Before we roped Rebecca into the business, so she later had to join us in the business. Well, she didn't have to, but she did, against all better judgment, and probably ended up saving the business in more ways than one. She's just phenomenal as a project manager, and we sniped her from our old team before she went back. But you know, Alex has been a tremendous business partner in all this. He has just been, you know, phenomenal. And you know, when I said, okay, this probably isn't going to work out with the original funding, he said, hey, I want to do this with you. And I said, well, it didn't have a name yet. I said, well, I don't want whatever this is going to be more than our friendship. Because I had driven with him. I mean, we only worked together for 2 years, but the friendship went on for a long time after, you know, 15, 20 years after. And I said, I don't want this more than our friendship. And I meant it. And he said, well, it doesn't have to be that way. Like, I'm a big kid. We'll do it the right way. And you know, we'll take the risk together. And so those two, you know, he was in the trenches. The first 6 years were brutal at times. A lot of highs, but a lot of lows. And I would say that, you know, some of the highs that really surprised were, okay, we were talking about driving a 917K. That's wild. Like, that was just flat out wild, right? But I'd done wild things in the past. Carrera GT for a week, 918 for a week, the Yellowbird, the one and only Yellowbird for 2-3 months.
That's insane.
Like who, you know, RS 4-liter for a while. Like all these various cars, like Sharkworks 3.9s for a month. You know, they really believed in what they were building. And they're like, you know, write it as you see it, as everybody else was, which was really tremendous. Of, you know, the professionalism was incredible. But, you know, going back to Aaron's Boxster, one of the most fun things I've done in the last decade, maybe all 25 years in the game, was Ulrika Lutz at Porsche Classic managed to get Grant Larson, who I know is a designer, is the designer of your car, Aaron, both the show car and the production car. He's just an all-around great guy. And then she found 2 production engineers for the headlights on your Boxster and all those fried eggs. And we did I think it's around 30-page story in 000 about just the fried eggs and all the variations, all the 986, 996 lights, which of course most enthusiasts hate, but I've always done, because there's, you know, the word elegance also has to do with a sense of economy and design. And those units, as you guys I'm sure know, were quite innovative. You know, there's 5 or 6 functions in one unit, no wiring. I came to learn no plumbing either, just slides right in, headlight washers or no. And so we get on this Teams call with Ulrika and I think Richard Allen and Grant Larson and the 2 production engineers. And these production engineers had clearly not interacted with the media. Like, they clearly were, what am I doing here on this call?
They're engineers,
Yeah, who's the weirdo from California? But as we started to talk, they got excited, and I started asking questions of, oh, okay, was it plastic for pedestrian safety? No, it was plastic because it was cheap. That wasn't required yet. And it was also plastic because we could get a tighter line to the fender. If you look at a 964 and you look at the gap around and then you look at the 986, 996, how tight that is. Plastic allowed for that. I said, okay, so what about these lines that are cast into the plastic? Like, oh, that's to help with the headlight washer when it sprays that the water goes the right direction. I said, oh, so is there a second lens without the line? They said, no. I said, well, why not? And they said, because we could only afford one lens. And then I started to ask about the chrome finish on the late 996, you know, the updated fried egg.
Yeah.
And there's 2 versions of that. I don't know if you guys know. There's the smooth one for turbos and GT2s, and then there's the Pringled one. The chrome is like Pringle-y under the clear for the Carreras. And so I asked about that. And I said, yes, this was to address a problem with the headlights because they were so horizontal. Like, you look at a 993 or a 964, they're very vertical.
Yeah.
And they were glass, depending. And I have to think about 993. But anyways, these were quite horizontal to the sky, and so they had a heat problem because the sun would drill down on them, and so the chrome and the 996s, the chrome under the clear, is to help with that. Okay. And so we started getting into all this stuff and some of the other challenges, like those headlights, they were learning. And so they had to actually lengthen the overhang of the 986, 996 to account for this headlight because it was quite long and flat in profile if you take it out of the car, but they needed to have a big radiator. And so they couldn't have put a turn signal in. It wasn't only cost. They couldn't put a turn signal in the bumper because of airflow. They were worried about this was their first radiator flat six car. Water cooled, fully water cooled engine, not air water, whatever. So, but by the time they went to the 987, 997, they had learned enough about the aero that they could shorten the overhang and get a turn signal back down the bumper because they learned so much with the 986, 996. So as I was listening to these two engineers and Grant,
more sense than hear you talk about that. Like, and I'm just, while you speak about that, just going through design of that in my mind.
Well, and so as I was listening to these three talk about this and asking questions and learning, I thought I had covered the subject fairly well when they were new cars. And for me, it was a microcosm of 000, everything we're doing. And I left the call and wrote the story, and I think it was around 27, 32 pages in 000, which I surely would have been fired for publishing at Excellence or Panorama, and rightly so. Rightly so. But here was an opportunity with 000 and without the ads and with a set number of pages at 256 pages per issue, we can really take 30 pages. And so someone might say, who cares about fried eggs? I'm very interested because it's a part of the evolutionary story of all Porsche. And I left that article, I don't think I wrote this, but I left that article with a personal viewpoint that two fronts. First, that phone call, that Teams call, was as exciting to me in a different way as any road test or track test I've ever done. Like the feeling in that phone call, celebrating the work of these two production engineers and Grant as examples or exemplars of their colleagues too, right? Celebrating their work and getting a chance to shine a light on, for lack of a better pun, what they did back then was really fun and rewarding. And as exciting in a way as anything, any drive I had done. Maybe not as visceral, but still quite exciting. And then and rewarding. And the other side of it was that I kind of started to wonder: were those headlights more important to Porsche's history than the Furman 4-cam engine? Is that too a sacrilegious question? I don't know, but I left it. That was the question that came to mind. You know, these headlights that everyone reviles, where everyone loves the 4-cam. And rightly so, on the 4-cam side. These headlights played a significant role in saving Porsche. No question. They couldn't afford a glove box in the cars.
Exactly. It was in such dire straits. I mean, that's a very good point. And I kind of revered that way too. I had an 05 Turbo S. So I was kind of like you were saying, I was putting my money where my mouth was. I was like, hey, and at that time when I bought that car, 996 turbos were all the value, you know. And I was like, man, this is such an expensive car at such a diminished value because it has such a stigma with its headlights. And I'm like,
right.
And then I chased one, you know, kind of a rare. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go get a Turbo S, you know, in 05, where they started already making 997s at that time. I was like, I'm going to get the last run of this and see it. And it was a phenomenal car. It was a beautiful car. It was so well put together. It was so fast. Even to modern day, I think I had that car 4 years ago, and it was still felt like a space shuttle on the road in 2021.
Well, you know, I can say two things to those cars. I went to the original press launch in Spain for the 996 Turbo. And so my point of reference was the 993 Turbo press car, which was a pretty limited drive. And those roads in Spain were, I don't know if you've driven in Spain, but parts of it, amazing roads. Parts of it, there's like a greasiness to the roads. And I was a passenger co-driving, and we were going around a roundabout, and very experienced driver next to me, and he got a little greedy with the throttle, and PSM came to fix it. And, you know, I noticed that greasiness when I drove the car as well, but the car was so impressive in Spain already. Then sort of two more memories with those cars. I spent a lot of time in those, three more memories with those cars as press cars. The next was here in the Bay Area. One came to my home in El Cerrito, and it was a Tiptronic, seal gray. And I went on the roads I grew up driving in high school in my little 914. And I remember just how quickly you could run those roads and how supreme you felt in that 996 turbo. Mm-hmm. It was like wild. It's like the world on fast forward. But then I got back and I was, oil ticking, and I'm sitting there in the garage looking at this thing. I'm thinking, and it's a Tiptronic. So anybody, they don't even need to know how to drive a stick. Anybody can go drive that car, and potentially close to that quick. Yeah. So that was another memory. And then Bob Carlson calls one day and says, hey, do you want to drive the 996 turbo at Black Rock Desert? And I said, what are you doing? He said, well, we're going to do top speed testing where they just set the land speed world record. Like, you're going to be able to go as fast as you want in a 996 turbo. Wow. And so I was like, Bob, are you crazy? He's like, oh, don't worry. There's going to be a cage. There's going to be a half cage, seats, harnesses, a fuel cell, and we're going to x-ray the tires and wheels. Like, and by the way, Hurley Haywood's going to be riding along. I was like, did you get Hurley some rubber underwear? Like, are you serious? So I didn't know if I wanted to do it, right? Yeah. And this is where it went south for PCNA. It actually heightened the exercise, but there's, in the hospitality industry, which is my wife's industry, there's this thing, there's the site visit, and then there's the actual event. So there's site visit, the Black Rock Desert, but it's a lake bed and it dries out and it's like pavement for 44 miles in any direction-ish. And so that's how it was when I got there. It was like 40 some odd miles of perfectly smooth pavement. It really is. When they came back a few weeks later for the event, there was a silt layer. And so they tell us, okay, so you're going to go do this with Hurley next to you. And the back end of the car will start walking. They'll start wagging, the tail will start wagging at about 140 miles an hour. And if you're not comfortable with that, you're okay. Just come back and you're done. But if you are comfortable, you'll come back and we'll spray out the wheels because they get imbalances with all the dust. And then you can go out and set your top speed. So I'm not a big top speed guy. Some people love it, but I like curvy roads. So I go out and, I try the 140 and it starts wagging. And it's kind of like you don't think about correcting so much as, it's not so much that you correct for your wag. It's like you think about it and that's kind of enough. Very hairball, feels very hairball. And kind of like being on a freeway at 70 or 80 on tires that should have some more tread on one end of the car. So it just starts this kind of, it just does this gently wags its tail. So I'm like, but it's kind of predictable. So I'm like, all right, I'll try it. So we come back and go again. And I later would find out USAC was there to time it. I think it was 177.865 miles an hour or something like this. So nearly 180 miles an hour on dirt. Wow. So I come back, and on the return run, I look over at Hurley, who by then had been a teacher for 7 or 8 years on all kinds of tracks. I said, hey, was that anything like driving at Le Mans in the rain? And he was silent. And I was like, uh-oh, I asked something really dumb.
Yeah,
like he said,
I must have really upset him.
I'm about to get it. And from a mentor. And he was kind of quiet, looking out in the desert, and he finally says, that's exactly what it was like.
Wow.
Right? But the final memory of 996 Turbo, before I turn to my feelings of them now, was Alex Pilevsky, co-founder of 000, and I took a Zanzibar red metallic 996 Turbo down the California coast from Big Sur down to LA. Oh, nice. And it was pouring. Like, it was just pouring rain, just gnarly. And I like to set the speedometer warning at a certain speed, and I'm not going to disclose that speed since we're on a podcast. But some speeds are more important than others, and so I set it for that because that car was very easy to get up to that speed, as you well know, having owned one.
Oh yeah.
And the soundtrack for our drive down the coast in the rain, in the mud, in the muck was something like ding, ding, ding. Like, we just kept hearing the ding. And so we get down to Hearst Castle, and there's this. Have you been to Hearst Castle?
No.
So there's this road that goes up to the top that you can't drive. You have to take the bus. And it's like, the road's awesome. And so Alex and I are at the back of the bus, and there's all these little tourists in there. And the Zanzibar cars at the bottom of the hill in the parking lot, covered in mud. Like the car's just shredded. Like it's and it looked fantastic. Zanzibar red metallic looks incredible when it's dirty. But we're in the back of the bus, and with every corner, Alex and I are like, oh, because we're imagining what it would be like in the 996 Turbo. So
thank you so much for listening to this episode of P-Car Talk. Connect with us on Instagram at P-Car Talk or online at pcartalk.com.